Okay, there we go. All right, much better, much better. Um, my name's Erin McDonough. I'm the program director at the University of Cincinnati, and introducing on behalf of our working group how to use an umbrella protocols for education outcomes research. And first of all, I'd like to thank the SAEM program committee for allowing us to present our work and hopefully help those of you in the audience consider how you might do this at your home institution. And first of all, huge, huge thanks to Dr. Natalie Kreitzer, who's sitting right there, and Emily Werf and Brittany Hahn, who were hugely instrumental in helping us to make this happen. So, over the next 20 minutes, we are going to kind of walk you through our journey on how we kind of created an expedited process by which medical education research specifically could get IRB exemption without having to go through the full IRB process for every individual study. And we'll talk through some of the benefits of that, some of the challenges we faced to potentially help you all go through this yourself. Um, as you all know, the IRB is often a significant hurdle or perhaps even a deterrent to conducting research. And I think this is particularly true for medical educators. We tend to be doers and not researchers, and we are, constantly developing curricula, educational interventions, assessment tools, and such. And we do this by necessity to meet the needs of our learners. But then we often don't really have the time or bandwidth to necessarily pursue studying those interventions and getting scholarly credit for our work. And the IRB is probably one of the bigger hurdles for this. For me, the IRB submission process is very intimidating. I don't consider myself a researcher. I think this is particularly true for residents who are trying to engage in medical education research. And the fact of the matter is most of these studies that fall under medical education are often IRB exempt. And so by not kind of following through and studying our interventions, not only are we not necessarily getting the scholarly credit for the work that we're doing, but that may actually impact promotion, at reappointment, that sort of thing. So, how does a umbrella protocol work? Well, the umbrella protocol is kind of an overarching protocol, which I'll discuss ours in just a second, that serves to help us expedite IRB approval or exemption, depending on what your protocol does, for subsequent studies. So, in our case, we developed an overarching protocol to obtain IRB exemption for medical education research, and thus, any studies coming after that, as long as they fall into the strict inclusion exclusion criteria of that umbrella parent protocol, then those studies can bypass the full IRB submission process. And these were kind of the four key aims that we tried to address with our protocol, our umbrella protocol. This is an assessment protocol. It's was originally written to basically study assessment tools, and in doing this, it was built to incorporate basically educational data that we collect anyway, just in doing our varying educational work, be it milestones, evaluations, pre-post pre-post surveys of educational ventures. And so with that parent protocol being approved for IRB exemption, then, as I said, any study that kind of comes after that, that's assessment based, which is the bulk of a lot of the medical education research we do, can get IRB exemption without the full process. And we have found that this has definitely increased the speed and the volume of scholarly activity that our group at Cincinnati has been able to produce over the last 2 years. So I will pass on to Dr. Paulson.
Thank you. So I wanted to define and compare and contrast these two terms. So I know at my own institution, so I started at University of Cincinnati with this work and have since transitioned to WashU in St. Louis. Umbrella is a bit of a taboo term. And so I want to show you some of the ways in which you can accomplish an umbrella protocol, but by framing it within the context of a data registry. So as Dr. McDonough said, the umbrella protocol is the idea as you create these strict criteria for inclusion or exclusion, and then anything that meets that criteria goes through. A data registry You can get the data registry approved or exempted by your IRB, and then any subsequent study that uses that registry also has an expedited path for approval. Where I think IRBs get a little bit nervous is the idea of a lack of oversight or rigor in reviewing these studies, and they're concerned that investigators may have a self serving interest to increase the speed or increase the volume of their work without actually questioning, does this work require consent? Is this work, ethical? Is this a question that should or can be asked? And so, in trying to get this approved by your IRB, again, we'll take you through the steps that we took to convince the IRB at the University of Cincinnati that this, in fact, was feasible. So, in order to get it approved, we had to prove five key kind of overarching principles and assumptions that allowed our protocol at UC to get exempted. And the first is the key statement that we're studying learners and learning. We're studying learners and curricula, not patients. Patients require IRB approval. Patients have protected health information. Learners really don't. And we can say that we are studying learners to make their educational programs better, which goes into our second interest. We as educators have a legitimate educational interest in the study outcome. And this is a really key phrase in human subjects research that the IRB is actually looking for almost in that block of text to say, aha, with this, you're intending to use this more for improvement of educational delivery, as opposed to, again, studying the patients, so to speak. So this is a key phrase. Your studies also have to be minimal to no risk, and this has key implications for consent. Some IRBs, despite being minimal to no risk, will still say that your learner has the right to opt in or opt out of a data registry. And when this has been published previously at places like NYU has a very large registry, they had an opt in. There are other places like UC where actually consent was wavered. They said your data is already part of the educational process, and we sought a FERPA waiver to address any of the privacy concerns of medical student learners. Next is that our analysis is by definition retrospective and anonymous. And so although you're entering data into a data registry that is linked to the learner, at the level of the analysis, this is all de-identified analysis. And you can look at learning over time, and I'll show you the ways in which we do that. But investigators cannot tie that to who that learner is for their protection and to avoid bias in our framework of the study assessment. And lastly, again, data can't contain protected health information, but that's not to say that we can't use clinical metrics at all. So one example would potentially be aggregate clinical data. So if you have a QI program for airway, for example, you can look at the number of airway errors that may be kind of cataloged under a specific learner pre or post some sort of airway curriculum to see if you have an educational impact there. You can't link that to the specific airway case, so that's okay. That's aggregate, more quality performance data. And typically quality studies are also deemed IRB exempt anyway. So those are our 5 key assumptions that allowed us to get this through. Next is a group of collaborators with varying backgrounds in medical education. We had clerkship directors through residency program directors, as well as faculty educators present. We said, if we're building this parent protocol, we need to be very comprehensive with all of the potential data streams that we would include, because anytime a data stream is added, you may have to go back and addend your parent protocol. So you want to be able to be broad yet defined, which I realize is contradictory. You can see here also that we chose to include a very broad continuum of learner, and that introduces power in a few ways. Since this is an assessment framework, it allows us to look at learners at different points throughout their journey through medical education, from student to residency applicant, through their whole residency experience, and even onward into faculty. For those that stayed and remained internal, you have a lot of data points over time. Again, you can also introduce, you have assessment frameworks that are standardized, so like ABEM in training scores, things that may be homegrown to your institution. It can allow you to look for validity between different assessment tools, as well as introducing other more universal assessment frameworks like high fidelity simulation and survey instruments to look at your curriculum experience. Next, I wanted to talk about how the registries are created. So you have this parent protocol, you're extracting educational data, and there's 2 different ways to do this. Some programs have a person whose job it is to create the database and put all data points in there. And that is done on a rolling basis for retrospective analysis. And while this is great because you have a giant database that you can play with, this is very labor intensive. And you may have this person entering data for questions that will never be asked. An option that we chose at the University of Cincinnati was to adopt a virtual data registry. And the idea there is that we all have access to this data as part of our educational role. And you effectively serve as a person that can enter that data into the database, anonymize it, and then push it to the investigator that only needs those specific data streams. So it's basically a database on demand, more or less. This is a lot more time and resource effective, and so that you're only generating the database and limiting its scope from a data protection standpoint to the questions that are asked when needed. Again, these data points can be mixed and matched, and we really wanted to emphasize a Kirkpatrick framework for the varying types of research questions that can be asked within education outcomes research, as you can see here. So we can mix and match survey, assessment scores, simulation performance, and again, aggregate real-world performance, not specific patient cases. There are many benefits to pursuing a umbrella IRB like ours. As Dr. McDonough said, the ACGME does have scholarly requirements for residents and faculty, so this is a very appealing option for those that may not gravitate toward traditional clinical or translational research. Having an umbrella protocol like this is very appealing to those that would identify as a dabbler and have less familiarity with the IRB process, and those that are more senior can then spend their time less on bureaucratic tasks and more on actual thought, creativity, mentorship, and then the productivity side of creating a manuscript. At UC, we also saw some interest in these protocols from those that typically don't work in education spaces. So some people that had been more traditional researchers in the clinical space or may have an ops interest can then start to ask more educational questions through just a different lens using our parent protocol as a reference. As a barrier, again, umbrella is not a universally accepted concept. We'll talk about ways to disguise it and sort of my institutional experience at WashU where this has affected me. Study oversight, again, you have to ensure is present to prevent protocol drift as well as minimize exposure of data. And with that, we're going to highlight our experience at two institutions.
So I'll talk a little bit about how a couple of projects that we have taken at UC from sort of that idea phase through the review process and on forward beyond that. The first one that we'll talk about came from this idea that, or this observation that boarding has made complete chaos of our educational environment in the emergency department. When you look at the background literature for like what should be done to help address, and improve the educational environment, one of the suggestions was to build and to have teaching files and teaching resources available for educators to be able to use when it's really boarded or overcrowded to help improve the education of the learners. The problem is like no one really knew or really knows whether or not that is something that's effective to improve teaching or even feasible. And so our idea was to try and do that to see if it is effective and feasible. And so that's when this sort of idea enters into this review process. Now, the way that our review process works is that the PI will write a one-page summary of their project using some background information, their proposed methodology, and then fill out a form with some specific questions about the study itself. Like, what population do you intend to study? Will you use any UCOM grades, UC College of Medicine, any PHI? And how are you going to store the data? What's the risk of harm? Very common questions that you would see in any IRB. That then goes to our education research engine where we can talk about the project itself and can maybe improve it or change it. And then also goes to two separate reviewers who specific task for them is to review whether or not this protocol, this project fits under the existing IRB framework, the existing umbrella. And if it fits under the umbrella, great. If not, then there'll be changes. Other institutions may do that differently. There could be just a single individual who knows the protocol super well. And that then, like this project, this form goes to that person and they say, yep, that fits, or nope, that doesn't fit at all. And so, and you need to change it in one way or the other. This was our proposal for this particular study. It was reviewed. Learners were part of the intended group within that umbrella protocol. It was an assessment of an educational intervention, and the outcomes and data were also part of the protocol. And so that's something we were able to take that project. We were able to collect data and see if it was feasible. Having these teaching files was a feasible initiative to help improve boarding the educational environment. Another Another project was this faculty development using high acuity, low occurrence procedures. And when this went through the review process, it was found that at that time the learner group, being faculty, was actually not part of the original umbrella protocol. But the assessment that was intended, like this was an educational intervention, and the outcomes were. And so what we ended up having to do was go back to the IRB and ask for an addendum to our original protocol to add on an additional learner group. So to extend it from just medical students and residents to also include faculty who are having these same sort of educational interventions. And after some discussion with them, we were able to get that addendum done. And then lo and behold, like this project was able to move forward and is moving forward in data collection. So far, since we've started doing this, we've had, these are the 8 as the time that I made these slides, but we've had 10 different projects that have gone through the review process and have gone through varying stages of their progression.
So, like I said before, I started on this umbrella journey while I was on faculty at UC and then transitioned over to WashU in August of 2023. And I was really pumped about this protocol. And through Dr. Santon, she said, hey, why don't you try to bring it to your new institution? So I did. And it didn't go very well. And I have a couple reasons why, and we're still working on it. I've not abandoned this, but I wanted to present my experience at WashU not as a you should not pursue this, but there are other ways that you can reframe a protocol that effectively accomplishes the same thing, just by avoiding some trigger words that make IRBs very, very nervous. So WashU first really balked at the umbrella term, and they said umbrellas are not allowed. Period, full stop. And their main fear with this is the idea of protocol drift. And so if you have a parent protocol that was started in, say, 1987, and you're still doing studies under that parent protocol, there are going to be some doubts over whether you've had that strict oversight and again have your criteria changed over time. There are also concerns about data exposure for when the study ends, what happens to this data. We had an answer for that. Additionally, WashU had a different interpretation of consent. So again, as I mentioned before, we had to ensure that our studies were of minimal to no harm, and this is data that is already existing as part of the student educational experience. WashU interpreted this as, this is their data, they still need to provide their consent, whereas UC had said, no, this data is already out there, I don't think that consent is necessary. And so again, you have people that have the same IRB training and have very different interpretations of what was effectively the same protocol. So as I'm continuing to work through this, my solution is to do what I explained before and take the umbrella concept and say, it's just a data registry, guys. We have trauma registries, you have ECMO registries, you have big health systems data registries, all for de-identified retrospective analysis. This is the same thing with educational data. What can be wrong with that? And that's really my plan to try to get this through. And I do think that, again, with the awareness of the Office of Medical Education, wherever you are, as well as key stakeholders, either in your program or with your overarching GME office, I do think that this work is possible. And the more programs that do this, I think that our whole field stands to gain because there is power in numbers. And we can be looking at siloed experience at individual institutions or say, hey, WashU, hey, UC, hey, VCU, hey, Michigan, other places that have protocols that have succeeded in this. What are you doing with your data set and how can we kind of combine here? And additionally, as Dr. McDonough mentioned, we deserve credit for the work that we're doing, right? It's going to help you with promotion. It's going to help disseminate information. It's going to give other people the knowledge and tools to improve their educational programs as well. The QR code is not our references, it's our actual protocol. And so this is the UC protocol as it stands. I think this was updated for last year's SAEM. Again, the only modification that has been made is simply adding faculty as a learner group. And so if you would like it, again, just to use it as a starting point because it got the language through at one institution, you are more than welcome to do so. You can also contact me or any of my other collaborators. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions along with Dr. Santon, Dr. McDonough, and Dr. Hill. I know that's really dense. Yeah.
So we tried even the vaguest versions of this, and it's been incredibly challenging with a relatively strict IRB. How do you navigate this retrospective de-identified data set, and yet having some unique identifiers so you can compare like how language on a slow compares to someone's placement in the match compares to someone's clinical performance. Like you need something to anchor those data points together, which the IRB would consider PHI, even though these are not patients. I know I'm kind of asking two questions. They're not
No.
patients.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's hard to explain, but then also there's got to be some identifiers
Yeah.
in there.
And that is hard work. I did data abstraction for one of our studies that actually we ultimately abandoned for reasons outside of the IRB process itself, and it was very tedious, like random number generator, faculty identifiers, pulling stuff like that. I think some of that goes down to whoever is going to be creating, whether it's your rolling data registry or your virtual registry, and you can assign a unique identifier up front so that the person that is doing the data entry can potentially know that.
So I think
Is that what you're asking, or Sally?
I would, if I was doing IRB language, I'm using an honest program, right? So I'm using my residency administrative
Exactly.
coordinator who's taking A, B, C, and D, creating a data set because they've got all the names and taking the names. And so you would use it using an honest program is the
Okay,
wording.
or sometimes referred to like sort of a codex, right? So like I know that like subject number 50 turns out to be Mary Jane, and if that becomes relevant to compare it to a different data set, then I have to dig into that codex and find out the other
Yeah,
record.
and ideally somebody else is doing it, so that the researchers aren't. You've got some administrative person who's taking the slow, the communication skills and their OSCEs, and somebody else is creating a data set, so that you as the researcher remembers that. And so that's the key. I think the other thing is if people are having a hard time getting it through, because I've talked to people who have, I would choose a swim lane. I would choose like a simulation swim lane and say, we're gonna do an umbrella IRB for a simulation, right? Because at least if you can get one thing through as like, here's the swim lane, everything that's done in simulation is for students, residents, and faculty, is an education intervention. If you can get it through one swim lane, then you can then expand out. Does that make sense? So that's how I would.
That was also Dr. Stanton's advice to me. Instead of doing the whole continuum of learners, create a swim lane for the learner type. So have an IRB protocol for the medical students, have an umbrella IRB protocol for residents, et cetera. There are different privacy protections for medical students versus residents, and that would negate some of that pushback from FERPA protection knowledge.
But I think sticking to a single area just makes it clear.
You talked about about possible future collaboration where institutions who have umbrella protocols in place. Do you foresee that everyone's sort of working off the same protocol and getting their IRBs to approve versus a central IRB?
So this is.
Or where do you think
She was
the IRB needs to
overreaching
go?
on.
Sorry.
But
I'm an optimist. Sorry.
maybe that's what you'd like to do, but seeing as you've gone through your IRBs who are umbrella
So it's a
protocols.
really interesting question. Like, so technically, like there are some, like our clinical colleagues who do clinical research, right? There's a single place that has an IRB and then others who've done
Mm.
satellite IRBs. So technically one might be able to do that. Like you could do a satellite of us, but that's not where we are.
Not what we're saying.
Does your IRB allow you to share de-identified data?
You'd have to require a separate IRB.
What's your reporting like? I have found that like the quarterly or annual reports of the projects that you have going on are as onerous as the IRB application itself. So when you have an umbrella protocol, do you need to report out on like all the sub
No.
projects, or just like the umbrella's fine, everything's good here, and you move on?
So it's an exempt IRB. And so whatever your rules are for exempt, I don't think it's come back up.
No.
It was approved probably 2 or 3 years ago.
Mhm.
And then I don't think we've not had something. So, and I don't know, somebody may know better. Maybe every 5 years that you have to do something like exempt, or you may never have to do it. And at that point, we would then have to report, but it's an exempt.
We did have to convince them that we had the tracking, but yeah.
Thank you. Only because I have a follow-up question on this then. So trying, because they're trying to push to make sure it remains exempt seems very, very much worth it.
Yeah.
As opposed to your IRB convincing you like, look, we'll just approve this.
Yeah. No,
Because then it's a whole separate situation.
And the reason the reason it is exempt is the de-identified data and no risk. Now, in reality, Jeff knows exactly who subject 5 is because they build something, right? Or he may know exactly who this, but he won't disclose it. Sorry, was there not?
Sorry if you guys mentioned this, or sorry if I should know this, but as part of the review process,
say for a medical student project, do you have someone from the College of Medicine or someone from the GV office? And does that either help an IRB approval process or does that help the efficiency of kind of getting projects going earlier?
So the medical school has its own umbrella. So for the medical school and all medical students, we have our own umbrella. And that's true of medical institutions where I've been from the start. And so, but in the approval process or any of that, we need to do
Are you required to list your study group members on the umbrella policy?
I think we just said everybody.
Yeah, I think we had a yeah, we had a list of kind of key people in educational roles, and then again, because the people and the personnel switch, your clerkship director might be somebody new, kind of titles effectively of people that would be engaged in this work as part of their assessment of their own curricula.
But you're only allowing people who you have put on a study member and have access to data in your project.
So, and Jeff,
Mhm.
Yeah, just so like I'm clear on the question. So like the original protocol having everybody with the entire faculty on there, or
Well, like our IOB, if we put any new person to be engaged on a research study involved, we have to submit an amendment to the IOB to name them, to put them on the registration form. Because I can just sort of see with an umbrella thing, if we were adding like a new person comes in and wants to do a simulation, say, and then it's a total different study team, right? So like I've got to somehow make sure all those people are vetted by our IRB to do research, right? So like I would have, I don't know, we have not been successful getting rid of them. Let's go that way. But I would have to just like put an amendment.
we've ignored that, is what I would do.
But you don't have to do that. You're okay.
I would have to say that at least when the protocol was coming through, anybody that was named on the protocol had to make sure that they were current for their city training. So there was a little bit of administrative upfront for those that, again, had the potential to participate in research, but hadn't yet to make sure that they were all city certified, because otherwise the IRB would not accept that.
But they didn't ask if projects that were covered under this umbrella would move forward or not.
Thank you for your time. We're happy to hang around.